Lecture 9, Impacts of Climate Change. So what is climate change going to do to the world and to human civilization? Well, the most obvious effect of climate change is a rise in global temperature. But there are plenty of other impacts as well, and this lecture is going to cover those impacts of climate change, starting with the rise in temperature itself. Now there's an issue here. When I talk about future climate change, there's no single right answer to what the climate in the future will bring. And that's because we don't know what human beings are going to do, and future climate, as we've now seen, depends on human activities, particularly how much greenhouse emissions we put into the atmosphere, and other effects as well. So how do we deal with this? Well, we have to make up little scenarios, little storylines to tell about what the future might look like in terms of human activities, and then we can use our climate models to calculate the climate that might result from those activities. And I'm going to describe some scenarios developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Let me pause and just say a little bit about the IPCC because it's worth looking at what this organization does and also understanding what this organization does not do. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is an outgrowth of the United Nations Environment Program and the World Meteorological Organization, and it consists of informal gatherings of hundreds of scientists, policymakers, and others to talk about climate change, the state of climate science, and to make recommendations about what we might do about climate change. The IPCC is not a research organization. Its main job from the scientific side is to draw together from the open literature and make summary statements about the state of climate science. The IPCC publishes many documents on different aspects of climate change. The most important ones are the assessment reports that are published roughly every 6 years, and the fourth assessment report has just come out, and so that's the latest statement on summarizing maybe 6 years before of climate science. There are also reports on how to mitigate climate change. There are also reports on how to adapt to climate change. But the only report that I'm really concerned with in preparing this lecture series is the report on the science of climate change. And there are plenty of other sources for the science of climate change besides the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change operates by a kind of consensus. They have to get approval from a large body of scientists and policymakers before they can publish the information they publish. So if anything, it's kind of a least common denominator understanding of what the state of climate science is at any given time. Now, what the IPCC put together to envision the future, these so-called storylines, are scenarios that are based on a kind of two-dimensional arrangement of what human behavior might be like. And they divide human nature in these two dimensions. One is whether human society decides to emphasize economic growth and economic development, and those are called the A scenarios. The letter A distinguishes them from the B scenarios, and the B scenarios envision a future society that puts more emphasis on environmental concerns and environmental preservation and so on. So the A scenarios are economic emphasis, the B scenarios are environmental emphasis. Then their scenarios are also numbered. The one scenarios, the number one scenarios, assume that globalization, that is, the spread of economic cooperation, the spread of cultural norms throughout the world, will continue. And that has some important implications, because it means, for example, that there will be more universal education, particularly of women, and that turns out to be a very important aspect of population, affecting future population. Number of other globalization factors go into the one scenarios. The two scenarios, on the other hand, assume that the world stays pretty much regionally divided, that different regions have their own subcultures, that economic cooperation doesn't develop to a very great extent. So those are a regionally based scenario, and then there are the global scenarios, the one scenarios. So crudely, this sort of two-dimensional space of scenarios for the future is divided into four scenarios. The A1 scenarios, which emphasize economic development in a globalizing world. The A2 scenarios, which emphasize economic development but in a world that stays more regional. The B1 scenarios that talk about a world with environmental emphasis and globalization. And the B2 scenarios that talk about a world that remains regionally divided but has environmental emphasis. Those are the scenarios. Now, within that, the IPCC actually considered some 30 or more different sub-scenarios. The only ones of which I'm going to talk about are within the A scenarios. The A1 scenario, there is the A1F1 scenario, or A1FI scenario, and that stands for fossil intensive. That's a scenario in which business as usual continues and we continue to burn fossil fuels at an ever greater rate, as we in fact are doing today. There's an A1B scenario, again, economic emphasis, globalization, and the B scenario stands for balanced. We replace some of our fossil energy with non-fossil energy, non-carbon-based energy. We get a more balanced picture. And then there's the A1T, T for technology, in which new technologies replace much of fossil-fueled technologies. And those create very different scenarios, as you can imagine, for future carbon emissions. I should mention one other thing about these scenarios with respect to population. In the globalization scenarios, the one scenarios, the A1 and B1 scenarios, the world population peaks at about the middle of the 21st century at somewhere around 9 billion people, and then it begins to decline. In the regionally based B2 and A2 scenarios, the population continues growing till the year 2100, the final year in which most of the projections are made. And that has important implications for energy consumption and for the amount of greenhouse emissions. And so the globalization scenarios, partly because of the spread of education and economic development, and particularly the education of women, results in lower birth rates and a population, world population, that peaks in 2050. That's a profound thing to think about. When I started teaching environmental studies, we always talked about the doubling time for the world population. We don't talk about that anymore because the world population is unlikely ever to double again. And it would be a wonderful thing in many ways if it were to peak in the middle of the century. That's what the A1 and B1 scenarios have it doing. So what happens with these scenarios? Well, the IPCC has worked out detailed assumptions under each of these scenarios and sub-scenarios for the emissions of all kinds of different greenhouse gases, for all kinds of other factors that affect climate. And you can look at tables and tables and tables of numbers they've developed that are their assumptions in each of these scenarios for what will happen with greenhouse emissions. And when we put that all together and put it into climate models, what's happened is a number of climate groups around the world have run their climate models with these different assumptions. Different models, as you learned in the last lecture, give slightly different results. So we've averaged together the results for these different model runs and come up with projections for what future greenhouse emissions, particularly carbon dioxide emissions, might look like under these different scenarios, and for what the resulting temperature increase might be. And let's take a look at some of those graphs. So we have two graphs, one about CO2 emissions and the other about projected temperatures. The CO2 emissions projections differ dramatically. If you look at the graph on the left side, the dotted line is the A1FI scenario, the fossil-intensive scenario, and you see under that scenario carbon emissions rising dramatically. They're starting at the left at that 7 gigatons per year that I mentioned. These are in gigatons of carbon per year. 7 gigatons per year, the same flow of carbon that I mentioned is coming from the fossil fuels and going into the atmosphere. They rise dramatically under several of these scenarios, particularly under the A1 fossil-intensive scenario, and under the A2 scenario, they also rise dramatically. In some of the scenarios, the B2 scenario and to a lesser extent the B1 scenario, they rise for a while and then decline. That makes a very big difference by the year 2100 in how much carbon dioxide we have put into the atmosphere. On the right are the temperature projections. They show less dramatic variation, and that's because they depend on the accumulated carbon dioxide, some of which is already there, and under all these scenarios, more carbon is still being put into the atmosphere, even if the rate of emission goes down. So the temperature range projected is not nearly as great as the range of projected greenhouse emissions by the end of the 21st century. Let's take a look at the global temperature. There's a light band that marks the range in which most of these models' predictions lie. The A1 fossil-intensive scenario, not surprisingly, shows the greatest temperature increase. It's a temperature increase here of about maybe 4.5 degrees Celsius over the century to come. The lowest rising scenarios include the B1 scenario. B1 curve shows a rise in temperature of perhaps only 1.5 degrees Celsius. So somewhere in that range, 1.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius, is probably what we can expect for a temperature rise over the course of the 21st century. That doesn't sound like a whole lot. I want to take a little bit of time to describe why those numbers mean something important. But let's just pause a second and look again at these graphs. We have a choice here. These are scenarios based on assumptions about human behavior, about what we decide to do about the rate of our greenhouse emissions. And if we continue business as usual with the A1 fossil-intensive scenario, we will end up in the year 2100 with greenhouse emissions that exceed 25, that approach almost 30 gigatons per year. Right now, it's about 7 gigatons per year. Incidentally, the A2 scenario actually exceeds the A1 fossil-intensive scenario by the end of the century in greenhouse emissions, and that's because that growing population actually causes more greenhouse gases to be emitted right at the very end. Although through most of the century, the A1 fossil-intensive scenario results in the most greenhouse emissions. But at the very end, the other one catches up because it's the one that has the growing population, whereas the A1 fossil-intensive scenario has a population that peaks in 2050. So the bottom line from these CO2 and temperature projections from many, many computer models, ensembles of different computer climate models being run with these assumptions from the IPCC scenarios, is that we can expect a temperature rise of somewhere in the range of 1.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius over the coming century. By the way, statistical analysis of the distribution of probable temperatures suggests it's very unlikely to be less than 1.5 degrees Celsius, but there's a substantial chance that it might be greater than the 4.5. So it's not kind of symmetric in that range. Very unlikely to be less than the bottom end at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Substantial probability that might be significantly greater, 6 degrees, 7 degrees even, than the uppermost of those model run projections.